my pleasure to welcome you on this frosty first Monday for some very warm discussion. Many of you know that before, we don't do intermission advertising here. We do it right up front while you're still awake, alert, drinking your tea and getting ready for the main attraction. Next month is our Stephen G. Carey Memorial Lecture. There are flyers that are out on the bench. Our lecturer is going to be Stephen Zunas, a well-known pacifist, nonviolent direct action person, and also a Quaker, one of the foremost academic experts on the Middle East in this country, at least. And he's going to be talking about Quaker responses to Israel-Palestine. I think many of you will want to be here, especially in light of the controversy that has arisen at Friends Central School. Some of you may have heard of that or read about it in the paper. And so I think an even-handed and open discussion will be welcome here on April 3rd. We're asking folks, as we did this time around, to register in advance because we expect a full crowd. And so if you register in advance, you will be guaranteed a seat. And if you don't, you may not be able to get into the front rows, where we still have seats for those of you who are coming in. We've got front row seats right up here. Don't be shy, come on up. Do it. That's what we like. People are just forward and just don't sit where the blue tape is. So this evening, we are pleased to have with us two extraordinary people. George is actually going to be taking the sort of second seat tonight as an interviewer. Many of you know George Lakey, and I won't say he can go without an introduction because otherwise why would I be standing here? George, as many of you know, was elemental in forming the Movement for New Society, if you go back that far. Also has been the figure who's formed Training for Change. Many of us have been taken that and been informed by it and are better facilitators and leaders because of it. So he's been a grassroots organizer and much involved in nonviolent direct action. He's taught at peace and social peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore most recently, but at Penn and other places as well. And I want to give a plug to his book. If you have not already read it, please stop in at the bookstore. George has brought some extra copies tonight. I have to say that Viking Economics has already gone through its first 2 printings and has just started on its 3rd. Due in no small measure, I think, to the fact that George has been traveling all over the country and in Europe and stopping at independent bookstores all along the way, and it's really caught fire. So you owe it to yourself to read this very hopeful book about how the Scandinavians got it right, and we can too. He is going to be interviewing our featured person this evening, Jonathan Matthew Smucker, who comes to us from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he is the one of the principals of Beyond the Choir. And the title of tonight's presentation is Reaching Beyond the Choir. I have to plug his book as well, Hegemony How-To, A Roadmap for Radicals in the 21st Century. A veteran of Occupy. He has been a grassroots organizer for over 20 years, is currently working on his PhD at Berkeley in sociology, but has been a student, much like our friend Mark Engler, of nonviolent direct action both as a theoretician, but most specifically as someone who's actually doing the organizing. And he's here to tell us why the left has kind of failed, in part because of its own, I'll let you tell us what it is. I would say it's its own short-sightedness and insularity in talking to itself and not reaching beyond the choir. So I also have printed some flyers for our May conference, Expanding Democracy in an Age of Polarization and Resistance, in which some of the things that we are going to be going over tonight will be part of our training to seize the moment that George and Jonathan will be talking about. While it may seem the bleakest of possible times to many of us, this is also the time when great opportunity presents itself. And if we are prepared to seize the moment, now is the time to do so. So, as our friend Brian Stevenson said just a week ago at Swarthmore, in one of the 4 points that he made, it is a discipline to maintain hopefulness when things are looking bleak. So that element I encourage us to hold on to as we listen this evening to George Lakey, home base again, interviewing Jonathan Matthew Smucker. Welcome, both of you. Let's give them a big hand.
Flip this up in order to get it working.
All right.
And what a pleasure to talk about the issues that you raise in this book. And
Thanks for being here,
you
George.
wrote it even before the election. So
I actually turned in the final edits on November 8th.
on November 8th. Oh, okay. All
In
right.
a cruel irony of history, yes.
Well, I'm glad that what happened was that I wrote a bunch of questions that I thought would be interesting and sent them to Jonathan, and Jonathan came back with, yes, but you didn't include, and what does all this have to do with now? So I'm so glad that that is so much on your mind, as well as I think everybody here, and certainly me. So I get to ask you questions, and you get to respond, however, and I don't get to use the whole time that way because it's important to get the questions from you folks as well. And John stands ready with a mic, so we'll be able to amplify. And this is being live streamed and all of that, so hello, stream. Welcome. Okay, so one of the things I so appreciate about this book is the depth in which you analyze the Occupy phenomenon, because it was really, really important, and it was a wake-up call of a certain kind, because people were making assumptions about the response and the lack of the response, actually, to 2008. And then there it was, right in our faces, in a very, very commanding and dramatic way. And then it fizzled. So many people have written about this, but you bring a depth of scholarship so that you're analyzing it at, I think, a very deep level. And it's one of the things that I so much value about the book. And, of course, I have a question about it, more than one. So you say that one of the things that happened was a natural phenomenon, that is, of people getting onto an Occupy site and finding each other and doing the daily work and so on, and wanting, and to some degree, for different people, experiencing a kind of community, a sense of fellowship, a sense of we're in this together, we're comrades, like that. And you say that's appropriate for people to look for that experience when they do social action, but that it became the overwhelming profile. And where was the balance? That's what was going on with regard to the outer world. So my question is, first of all, I think it would be helpful if you filled in a little bit more why you thought that, but also, what would the balance look like? I'm curious about what you think, in the light of the theory work you've done as well as your activist work, what that balance might have looked like.
Thank you. And let me just back up for a second before I do that and say thank you very much, George, for being here. I'm honored to be up here with you. And I learned so much from you over the years. And thank you, Pendle Hill. Thank you, John, Lena, and everybody else who made this event happen. And thanks to everyone for coming out. It's great to be here with you. And now, your question. Yeah, I think that in broad strokes, people get involved in social change efforts for two big reasons, right? There's lots of idiosyncratic reasons for each individual, but in broad strokes, we want to find community with each other. We want a sense of bonding and to be part of something bigger than ourselves, but we also want to make a difference. And we want to affect outcomes. We want to impact the direction our society goes. We want to be efficacious. And those two things can both be achieved, but they can also be drives that are in tension with each other. And I call this in my book the political identity paradox, or something related to this. Social movement scholars talk about this as the tension between expressive motivations and instrumental motivations, expressive being self-expressive and instrumental being affecting political outcomes. I think that there's something valuable in that language, but when I started Beyond the Choir over a decade ago as a side project, I was looking at the question of why the left tended to be so insular, why the pockets of the left that I had been in were so insular, why we were talking to ourselves. And I began it kind of as a social psychological inquiry and got onto this social movement literature of the expressive and the instrumental and how they're in tension with each other. But as I looked at it, I came up with the terminology of life of the group versus what the group accomplishes beyond itself. Now that's longer, but life of the group to me was more at what was going on than expressive, because when we hear expressive, we think self-expressive, individualistic, right? But I really think what's going on is a group dynamic. It's a hunger to be part of a group. It's a hunger and to belong. And as my own inquiry and research moved from the social psychological dynamics to looking at history and what kind of economic systems are causing this to be like this so severely right now, because I do think that the insularity of the left over the past 40 years is at a higher level, even though you've always had these tendencies, than it was beforehand. And what's going on there, and in recent years I came upon people like Habermas, who's really hard to read, but he talks about how capitalism really disrupted the fabric of traditional life first, but then as we reorganized ourselves in society to rebuild community in the wake of that disruption of traditional life, now over the past half century, capitalism and modern life have kind of colonized even the fabric of our community in ways where the logic of profit, private profit, and the logic of profit and bureaucracy is what Habermas names, have penetrated everywhere we go. And we long for this deeper sense of community, and we try to construct it. And that's a good longing, right? It's good for us to find that, but what happens at a place like Occupy is that we find that in the park, right? We find hints of it, and it symbolically represents all of our longing for community. And then that's all fine and good, but the problem is when that becomes the only goal, right? So defending the park becomes more important than what the park does as a symbol that's building political power to intervene in the political systems that could transform economic, political, social outcomes in our society, right? So it's great to find that community, but when that community starts to then guard itself and start to be like, I'm a day oneer, I was here on the occupation on day one, who are you, right? And starts to guard its kind of subcultural essence and go deeper into that instead of looking for how to share that out and how to align and activate more people into aligned political action, that's when it becomes a problem.
So what might it have looked like, just as for illustration, if it had been balanced? Because that's what you call for in the book, a balance of the two. You're not saying we should give up the quest for community, but that we should pay attention to outcomes. What would a balance have been like if that had existed in Occupy? And you were deep, deep, deep into Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street, not into Wall Street. Yeah. It's like when I worked for School of the Americas Watch, and people would introduce me as working for the School of the Americas. I was like, no, watch. So, I think that balance did exist in pockets and at times and for some people. So I think, in fact, I think most people who got involved, who came in off the street, were intrigued by some of the this and mic checks and some of that cultural stuff, which also there were some instrumental purposes to some of those tactics, like the people's microphone, right? But it also becomes this ritual. It becomes this way of signaling that you're part of something. And, the sociological term, collective effervescence, right? It feels good to be part of it. People liked that, but they also wanted something that intervened. So I think that balance did exist for a lot of people. I think there's just a tendency for it to kind of go off the rails. And the way that happens, I think, one, there's an oppositional psychology. When you're fighting something about the status quo, it becomes tempting to exaggerate the ways that you're different from the status quo, and that can become projected onto all of society. And that's how we get into the mindset where, Michael Moore, because his films are successful, and we are suspicious of anything that's successful, right? It's kind of the I liked Green Day before they were cool phenomenon, but on social change, right? Where we start to guard anything that becomes successful, and there were currents of that in Occupy from day one. There were also currents within Occupy that were very much into it being as effective as possible. And it was a dynamic tension, and sometimes that tension, I think, did go well, and other times it didn't. I say in the book that there's a role for leadership to play in navigating this political identity paradox, in figuring out ways where people can be involved in a way that both furthers the identity of the group and strengthens it while connecting to a broader base. And so, I give Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at one stage in its operations as an example. I also give the negative example. There's lots of things going on here, and these are apples and oranges, right? But Students for Democratic Society and the path for one faction becoming the Weather Underground, on some level, this is what's operating, right? I call it hardcoreism, where people start to signal to the center of the group so much they become their own reference points, and they lose touch with what broader bases in society, with what seems viable to them. And once armed struggle, in the case of the Weather Underground, becomes the thing that, if you're serious about the group, you're committed to that, right? Once that becomes the case, it's hard to argue against it, because arguing against it puts your own sense of whether you belong in the group into question, right? But SNCC at one point, people also wanted that hardcore, I want to do something hardcore. Well, you come down to the South and you register voters, you talk to people that you didn't know how to talk to, you fail at it, and you stick with it until you get good at it. And so the hardcore thing, which was hardcore, is something that took people out of signaling to the center of the group and forced them to interact with a broader base. So it's kind of setting up tactical mechanisms that force people out. I think we need that right now, right? The left broadly hasn't been engaging a lot of areas in this country, and we're seeing the consequences of that with this election, right? So it would be great to get a lot of the young organizers who often come from middle-class backgrounds as a trend, not everyone, not me, and there's some working-class people background, but a lot of people are from middle-class backgrounds and have been in there's nothing wrong with that, have been in kind of a self-referential culture and a conflict-averse culture a lot of their lives, and have come to this thing called activism as the self-selecting thing, right? we need mechanisms right now to train people like that, to be organizers, to go talk to people they don't know how to talk to fail at it and get good at it, and kind of reorganize the premises of having a society.
So are you saying that the one task of leadership would be to come up with tasks like that, like SNCC did, that pretty much force people to go beyond the choir in order to get something done, even though they may be way out of their comfort zone while they're learning how to do that?
Absolutely. I think that is a role of leadership, is to figure out how to design things like that. And it's a question I've been wrestling with here in Pennsylvania. We're doing organizing in Lancaster, and we're thinking, like, is there a statewide listening project that targets key districts that we need to flip in 2018, and where we need to do social movement work in the meantime? It's hard. There's not a silver bullet. Like, you don't just do a listening project for its own sake, but is there a way to tie something like that to some instrumental goals for a political operation, which we need right now? And I do think that there is a role for leadership to think of things like that and to not be shy. That's another thing I say in my book. We need leadership, and it's one of the things that was another struggle in Occupy was the difference between saying we're a leaderless movement, which makes everyone afraid of stepping up, and saying we're a leaderful movement, which makes us able to look at what leadership is and strategize together about how to build more leadership and to get it out there.
I'm curious about your response to the, as an additional task, one you mentioned is a listening project that would get people out. Another kind of task that would get people out would be campaigning around a specific winnable goal. At least that's what we found in Earthquaker Action Team. That in order to achieve, for example, our victory with the PNC Bank, we had to grow from a living room size group to being in 13 states. We just had to if we were going to win. And we said we wanted to win, so we just had to do that, right? So I'm wondering, though, because there are references in the book to campaigns, but you don't fully flesh that out. What do you think about a campaign as a kind of task or a kind of device that would get us outside our comfort zones?
Yeah, I think that's right. Campaigns, if you're not tied to some specific political outcome that you want to achieve, it's the tendency is going to become a group that exists for its own sake, right? For the sake of what I call the life of the group. And that's fine. It's fine to have groups that exist, that where we find community, but that's not necessarily a political group. So when we say a campaign here, we're talking about, it could be an electoral campaign, but we're talking about issue-oriented campaigns. A campaign being there's a goal at the end of it. You think of a strategy to achieve that. You think of the decision makers that can grant that. You think about how you're going to build power to influence different people to achieve that end, right? And there's a time frame and all that. I do think that campaigns can really ground people in instrumental goals in important ways. It's complicated, as Mark and his brother Paul have said in their book, that not everything is a campaign. There are these weather-changing moments, right? Like Occupy, which it didn't make sense for Occupy to be a campaign, at least at the outset. Some campaigns came out of it, like Occupy Homes, where there's specific campaigns that then ground it and that take off in important ways. But not everything's a campaign. I think that's the only pushback I would say to that. But the last thing I would say is we've run campaigns a lot in the past 40 years in an activism model instead of an organizing model. And with staff-heavy organizations that don't have active membership, that rely on putting something out there, attracting self-selectors, instead of kind of bringing it to people in the spaces that they organize themselves around in the fabric of everyday life. And so that's part of what I think we need to do to get out of the insularity right now, not just to design campaigns, but design campaigns that organize and activate bases of people that are not currently active. And right now, it's ripe for the picking. People want to be involved, and they don't have a structure to plug into. The little structures we have, like I heard a meeting in Hudson with Surge that usually has like 24 people, like 400 people came out, right? So people are plugging into whatever structure they can. In Lancaster, we've built a structure, and now we turned out 2,000 people the other night, which is unprecedented for us. But it's so there we have to build, and even that, a lot of it is it's not all the way there yet with organizing bases and going out. A lot of it is just facilitating self-selection. I think that there's a lot further we could go in reaching beyond the choir, as it were.
What can we learn from Occupy Homes? Because I think that wasn't well publicized, that particular campaign that grew out of Occupy. What can we learn from that? And what was it anyway? Just to say what it was.
Yeah, and it did have a good run of publicity. December 6th was the big coordinated day in 2011 when 50-some actions happened across the country. Occupy Homes was the idea of supporting people staying in their homes, fighting foreclosures, and sometimes that involved occupying the yards of people who were being foreclosed upon to stop the houses from being foreclosed. Nationally, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of homes were saved because once people started to fight back, the banks would often do what they should have done in the first place, which was renegotiate the principal or the payment, find a way to work with the person, right? Instead, they were just any violation of the terms of the mortgage, they were evicting people. And some churches were saved like this. Some local legislation was changed in different cities. Minnesota and Atlanta were two of the strongest places. There were other places that were strong. Those two places came about when people came to the occupations, Occupy Atlanta and Occupy Minneapolis or Occupy Twin Cities. Homeowners who were being foreclosed on said, I'm being foreclosed on, can you help? And in both of those places, parallel, this is within within a month of Occupy, ended up setting occupations in these people's yards and fighting the banks. Interesting, I'm going to give a little behind the scenes view of this. In both places, some of the free-for-all issues that happened in Occupy started to blow up, but in people's own houses and backyards where there were some real dysfunction in the encampment. And unlike Occupy, because some organizers had been working with the homeowners and had some authority to act as leadership, which other people didn't really have in Occupy, they closed ranks on some level and they set standards for how you had to behave if you were going to be in this person's yard. And that shifted the dynamics of the campaign and proved that there was a leadership capable of winning. And I'm not glorifying that everything was perfect in these places, but in both Atlanta and Minnesota, two of the most successful places that saved multiple homes and did other things, those places, they did build a leadership core that gave some direction to the rest of the organization. So that's, it's interesting because a lot of times the ethos of Occupy was to pretend like leadership didn't exist, and to feel bad if you were stepping up as a leader. And I advocate that that leadership is important and that it's always happening, and if we're not explicit about when it's happening, it's not accountable. Joe Freeman made this argument a long time ago in The Tyranny of Structurelessness, that it's better to name leadership, to name what it is so that you can hold it accountable and you can strategize about what it looks like in your organization or campaign.
That might be controversial. Do you want to say a little bit more about your statement, there's always leadership? I mean, that sounds almost sinister, Jonathan.
Well, it depends how we define leadership too, right? Is leadership meaning that somebody's in charge, or does it mean that somebody's taking initiative in a way that is shaping things in a particular way, right? There's lots of definitions for leadership, and there's lots of leadership happening in ways that we don't always call leadership, right? There's behind the scenes, like Ella Baker is the classic example in the civil rights movement, right? Not recognized by a lot of people, a lot of the populace as a leader, but doing incredible leadership work behind the scenes. So one thing is for us to not just think that leaders are the person in front of the camera, right, or the person in front of the room, but to look for where leadership is happening behind the scenes and to recognize that and give people credit for it. So there's an affirming thing that we often need to do. But and a related word is authority, right? There's like authority being in charge, but then there's authority being like, you have authority, you have a lot of authority over some of the issues we're talking about because you have a lot of experience. It's authority that you've earned, right? It's different than like I'm George Lakey, I'm in charge, and I'm going to tell you all to go do this now, right? People would laugh at you, even though they love you. Does that clarify?
Yeah, that's helpful. It's helpful. Another issue that I think is very in the air right now that came up during Occupy that you might be able to help us on too is the deflection of the primary target, because it started out that it was Wall Street that Occupy was fighting, right? And that was what a contribution, that 1% thing, giving us a vocabulary, right? And really like naming it, pinning the tail on the donkey. There it is. It's Wall Street, and that's why we're doing our occupation here, and so on and so on. And then there was repression from the police, whose job it is to do repression. And when it's called for by the economic elite, it's the economic elite doesn't come out in their pearls and limousines and club us. They have other people, working class people, do that. And so the police were ordered to do stuff, and there was tear gassing on Brooklyn Bridge, if I remember right, and so on. And then it looked to me, and I wasn't in New York, I was in Philly, but it looked to me as though there was a deflection then from opposition to Wall Street. Well, let's not talk about Wall Street so much. Let's talk about how terrible the police are. And I can picture that happening now. I think in some places it has already. So I'm wondering whether there you were in the middle of that. What your thoughts might be about if there were people taking leadership in the sense of taking initiative to keep the eye on the prize, so to speak. What might be done?
Yeah, that's. I mean, obviously, like the 99% versus the 1%, or the people versus Wall Street, is a much more advantageous polarization than protesters versus police, right? Honestly, though, I think Occupy did this better than the global justice movement did a little bit over a decade before. I could be wrong. I haven't done like a full assessment of it, but I do think that the targeting, there was some level of continued discipline on the target, even though that frame also existed, right? And there was a lot of strategizing about it. I mean, I was in the PR working group, and we talked about it a lot to like keep naming the villain. And it's tricky because when there is police brutality and abuse, you need to call it out, but at the same time, you don't want to lose who the enemy is, right? Or who the threat is. So I do think that is a tricky dilemma. I think it's related to what I call, I forget what I call it, but the rhetorical strategy of our opponents within Occupy, like Mayor Bloomberg at the time, when he went to clean the park, right? By doing that, he's calling us dirty, right, and unsanitary, unhygienic, right? And so there's a constant push to name the intervention of Occupy Wall Street, and this happens with opponents of all social movements, as those dirty hippies in the park, right? As opposed to a symbol of a crisis that affects all of us and a potential political force that we could all be part of, right? So it's like you otherize it as this thing that's unrelatable to most people. Those dirty hippies at the park who drum at 2 a.m, and some of them are defecating on the neighbors' doorsteps, right? And so then there's a fight that a lot of us engaged in to try to expand who that we is and try to tell a different story. So the Tumblr of like, we are the 99% was a really important thing from the get-go that amplified stories from all over. We would tell stories, we would amplify voices in the PR working group of like, school teachers in rural Iowa who would go to march in solidarity with Occupy. People in West Virginia who would send knit caps. Occupy Faith, leaders of congregations coming and bringing members of their congregation with them, or bringing Occupy kind of to the pulpit. Veterans of the 99% was a day that we marched with veterans. So the fight there is to expand who that we is, to bring more voices into that we. It's not the same exact thing you talked about, but it overlaps with that. Protesters versus police is otherizing these protesters as this other person, as this unrelatable other.
That's helpful. Yeah. Whoa, these are tough issues.
Yeah.
You didn't solve them all.
No. Yeah, and it's always messy, you know?
And it's messy.
Yeah, you can't control these things, but you can maybe influence them if you're
But
lucky.
the thing I love about the book is it really lays them out in ways that you can't just dodge it and just talk about tweets from Trump instead. Right? I mean, your book really lays these strategy questions out in such a way that if we want to do strategy at all, but of course, I mean, that was another, that's an obsession of mine, strategy. And I was noticing with regard to Occupy Wall Street that it seemed, or Occupy Philadelphia, I was noticing with regard to Occupy, it seemed to me that there's no way that ground could be held by people forever. And so it was very reasonable to anticipate at some point the Occupy would be removed from the site. So anticipating that, there are various options. One option would be, I suggested to the Philly people, why not declare victory and leave? And leave in order to do something even bolder and more expansive beyond the choir. Because you're going to be out anyway, and if you're going to just be out by some kind of confrontation, which, oh shucks, we lose, losing isn't the best place for movement people to be. I prefer winning every chance there. So, but that's a strategic concept, anticipating what the opponent will do, and then making our moves in the light of that. But tell us more about what goes on in strategy contexts in these movement moments, like Occupy was, where people would actually be able to think strategically. It's easy and equate, but what's it like? And could you imagine people in those kind of spontaneous vortexes? Can you imagine people actually strategizing in the sense of anticipating an Occupy, the opponent's move, and getting ready for it?
Yeah, I mean, it was happening. It was happening all the time.
Tell me.
And some of it was happening in formal processes, like the General Assemblies and working groups, and some of it was happening in informal processes and informal leadership that did exist, but was happening because the formal processes were pretty dysfunctional. Like a General Assembly was a pretty hard forum to have deep strategy conversations, in my opinion. And for better or for worse, I opted to not do that very much. But what you just said, those conversations were happening amongst all kinds of people. I mean, most people didn't think that the occupation was going to last forever. But it posed a real interesting dilemma, because the occupation did have value beyond just tactical. Or that's a complicated assertion, but what I mean by that is, just as the symbol of Occupy got us out of our single issue silos and gave us a common vocabulary, the physical space of Occupy got a lot of organizations out of their silos and provided a space for us to come together and work together. So losing that space in some ways was a loss that we had to strategize about how to make up for. And some of that loss, like in New York, happened at like 50 Wall Street, this building that we were informally occupying parallel to Occupy, and having all the, like, most of the meetings happened at 50 Wall Street at one point. And so some of that was still happening, and so you had these hubs that were continuing. But that was a loss. It was hard to figure that out. Like, how do we make up for that? And that, I think, does explain some of the attachment to the park. Occupy Homes in some ways was a solution that some of us were eager for, was to take this thing that was a symbol and to land it in campaigns that affect people's lives. And we actually got a lot of coverage in the initial wake of, like, I mean, I think it was the Wall Street Journal that was like, Occupy has like figured out a way to actually talk to people's pain in a way that might affect it. Like, I forget, they said it more eloquently than that, but there was some impressed thing of like, this could turn into, and in some ways it did. These things aren't all or nothing. Like, a lot of people coming out of Occupy went into like the Fight for 15, went into a lot of important campaigns, the teacher strike in Chicago, right? That a lot of Occupy alum like learned a lot of things from these things. But as Occupy itself, I think it had a lot of an allergic reaction to transforming into more of a political operation from the get-go. And so people tried that with 99% Spring too, and there was such a guardedness that people were very, very quick to accuse people of co-opting Occupy in anything that we did in that regard.
So that's the second time you've brought up this co-opting that is recognizing some degree of success as problematic instead of as something you want to build on. Could you go into that a little bit more? Because I think that is not completely gone, that tendency.
I mean, to me, Occupy, like a lot of things I've been involved with, but it took it to new heights, was hyper allergic to co-optation, so much that it blinded it to what that even means, right? So it was like when Democrats started using the 99%, it was like, well, screw them. But literally, I mean, people were like, well, screw them. And I mean, there was like Miley Cyrus made a video of police brutality at Occupy saying like, stand up, these brave people are standing up. And somebody like tweeted, a prominent person tweeted like, real revolutionaries occupy, Ms. Cyrus, like, we don't need your help, basically. And you know, and it was the same with John Lewis came to the park, a symbol in Atlanta, a symbol of the civil rights movement, and he was prevented from speaking because politicians shouldn't be speaking. Now, this isn't to say, which was very embarrassing for me, right? This isn't to say that there's not real issues with co-optation. Co-optation happens, but it happens when you're successful. It's a good problem to have, right? And we do it all the time, right? Like politics is about aligning wills, co-opting different wills. It's like synthesis, tension. It's political wills in tension and alignment with each other. It's a dynamic process, right? And, you know, like right now, I think progressives would like to co-opt some of the Democratic Party, right, to like win, right? That's a whole can of worms. I shouldn't even open that one up. But co-optation happens, right? And there are concerns about it, right? We don't want somebody to be able to take something, our message, and get points on it and not do anything, right? But when they do take our message, it actually gives us more leverage to pressure them because they've now made a promise. And then you can so this is a dynamic process. It's not an either or thing.
I'm eager to let people get into this, so this will have to be my last one, and it's a little bit confrontive. I haven't known you since you were a little boy, really, but I know enough about your background to think of you as a product of the choir. That is, you brought up Mennonite, right? Yeah. And
Mennonites can really
brought up Mennonite. And then when you left Lancaster County, where did you go? But you went into a Roman Catholic choir in Washington, D.C. There was a group of pacifists doing all those amazing things. And so you kind of went from choir to choir. And so even though I understand that it's important in your book and for us now to know that there is such a thing as beyond the choir, and we have to go there if we want to make real change. Nevertheless, I'll bet you picked up something positive about the choir. So I want to just push you a little bit to admit, was there something about the choir that
the choir's amazing. I mean, my best friends are in the choir. It's interesting. You know, I mean, I grew up conservative Mennonite. I grew up conservative, rural, working class. So I had this initial break that then I dove deep into like an activist subculture in the 90s. And so there was this translation work that happened, you know, because in some ways that choir of radical leftists, right, for me to find out about it and get involved, I was an unlikely person, right? But then diving into it, I found, I mean, I think I say this in the book, like I remember writing in my journal, like I found my church. And I was talking about Earth First, right? I was talking about an occupation I was part of with Earth First and the American Indian movement in Minnesota. And it was deep and it was moving. And And a lot of ways, the kind of breaks I had of disillusionment with our own insularity were very painful for me because there are so many beautiful things about the subculture that I love, that I found meaning in, that I found community with. And so to start to criticize it and to call out that insularity was, one, I was clumsy at it at first, and it was, that was kind of a painful process, but it's because there's so many beautiful things about it, right? There's so many beautiful things about Occupy Wall Street, about going and being part of this ritual with people, about affirming life, about affirming social justice, about affirming participatory democracy, right? That's all very beautiful. So yeah, the choir is great.
Okay, time for you. Let's see your hands. Are you going to MC this? This is great.
I'm going to carry this around.
Super.
You both get to keep your microphones in case you want to be able to.
Great.
So if you would just wait until I get there with the microphone, and if you'd hold it just about the way I'm doing, like a lollipop right under your lip, good place to hold it. And I see a hand that's very close by.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about sometimes the opposition has a good idea and mixed in among their bad ideas. And how do you draw that idea into your circle as and make use of it?
Are you talking about like tactically, strategically, or a policy position?
What I had in mind is in the political discourse, like in Washington, sometimes the conservatives have a good idea that the liberals should take advantage of it, and sometimes they don't, just because it wasn't invented there. It wasn't invented by the liberal group. And how do we capture that idea and move it into our circle?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways to interpret your question. I'm gonna take a stab at it. One, I think that as organizers, we should always be looking for common ground with people that we're trying to organize. The tricky thing is sometimes you have an opponent that you always want to paint as an opponent. So I think that's where some of these things can come into tension. I think we should never, ever be too proud to learn from our opponents, right? Our opponents are not too proud to learn from us, right? The Tea Party, they study rules for radicals. The neocons, they read Gramsci. So we should not think that, I've been like called out in trainings for like using the term branding, because people are like, branding, that's what corporations do. Well, corporations spend billions of dollars studying human behavior, right? We can take some lessons from that and use it for good, right? So that's more on a tactical level. But I think on a more value level, like right now, let's not project the worst Trump supporters onto all Trump supporters, right? There's a lot of complex reasons why people voted for Trump, and a lot of it has to do with the epic failures of the Democratic Party for the past 40 years, failing to fight visibly for working people, and for people having real resentment against the political establishment that they feel abandoned by. Now, is race part of that? Is racism and misogyny and xenophobia part of that? Absolutely, it is, and we have to have an analysis of that. But we can also look at what are there positive, if you're trying to organize or trying to get people to change their vote, let's say, or trying to organize a community, and you're trying to understand why people voted for Trump, look for reasons that might be positive reasons, even if you wouldn't have done the same thing, right? Because that's where we can connect and find common ground, and you might be able to explain to them, well, this would be a better way to vote, or this would be a thing to get involved with.
Okay, maybe we have a better view. Do you want to?
Sure, right here I see.
two things. One, I wanted to address what you said, and indivisible is the prototypical example of taking what the Tea Party did and using it ourselves to great advantage. I mean, there are now in every single county across the country demanding town halls and going to their representatives, because what Indivisible said, and they were all former staff, congressional staff members, was that the Tea Party was so effective because the only thing a congressperson really cares about is getting reelected. So he's the only one that's going to listen to you. So go to your congressman and yell and scream and insist and be obnoxious, and it's been working very well. Because, you know, it starts with 1 week there was a group of 20, and the next week there was 100, and the next week there were 200, and it's just really been very effective. But one thing I wanted to ask you particularly was, from where I was so excited about the Occupy movement, not just because of what they were doing and exposing the 99% and 1%, which I think was the huge contribution from that. But I got very excited because somebody put out a very concrete plan of calling for a new government and people to gather in Philadelphia as they did originally, and it was worked out there would be one representative, one female and one male from each congressional district and so on, and I really thought that was going to happen, and then it disappeared. What happened to that?
I don't know. I think there's other people in the room that know that answer to that better than me. Yeah, we're all traumatized and we don't want to talk about it. No. I'm going to give my best guess, or what I would estimate. I think Occupy was, there was a lot of toxicity that emerged in Occupy. And there was I remember going to greet the Occupy road bus tour in my hometown of Lancaster and walking up to somebody excitedly and being like, hey, like, have we met before? I don't think I saw you. Isn't it great that Occupy is so big that people haven't met each other? And they're like, yeah, who are you? Right? Like there's a who the hell are you culture that emerged. There was a time when everybody was going to 8 different working group meetings because there was such a fear of missing out. So everybody was meeting all the time and not doing any tasks, right? And so a lot of things happened. I'll be honest, when the raid happened, I think this is my first time admitting this publicly, but when the raid happened in November, there was a lot of relief for me because there were some real dysfunctional things happening that I felt were going to come to a head in a really bad way if we were not relieved of the situation. And it also, because I was, with what George was saying, I thought that we needed other things to focus on, other tactics to give legs to the next phase. That one in particular, I was not as involved with, so I just don't know the particulars. I do remember hearing some reports where that kind of toxicity thing came up. There's also the allergic reaction to going in any kind of a governing direction that I think was a big part of why things like the 99% spring didn't work out. But I don't have a definitive answer. I wasn't there were a lot of moving parts in Occupy, and that was not one that I was very involved with. Lena? And George, if you have any interjections with any of these questions, please feel invited.
How do you ensure when you're trying to speak beyond the choir and you're trying to sort of activate these different bases, how do you ensure that folks at the margins aren't being left out and left behind, or folks who have traditionally been left out and oppressed have that replicated in our movement spaces?
It's a great question. So there's a couple things. At the end, you said movement spaces, which I was going to answer it in a different way. I'm going to answer it that way first and then come back to the movement spaces. There's ways, when you talk about, so we do workshops, we do partnerships with different grassroots organizations and movements about, broadly reaching beyond the choir, right? And so there's a broad-facing version of that, like how do you have popular messaging? How do you have broadly resonant messaging that taps into popular symbols? But then there's a very particular version of that. How do you connect with particular communities and speak in a way that mobilizes the particular communities that you want to be mobilizing with and in action with, right? So here's a real meta answer to your question. I think because this gets at one of the central dilemmas of building a broad popular movement in the United States is that we have the popular class-based language, right? Basically an economic populist movement in tension often with I'll call them particularistic movements, or some people call them inclusionary movements that focus on a particular group that's advocating for its inclusion in the polity, its equality. So African Americans, LGBTQ people, indigenous people, right? These different interests. So there's this tension between a particular group advocating for itself and for its rights, its equality, its inclusion in the polity, and building this broader kind of populism, right? And those things have come to heads in really ugly ways in American history. And in a very immediate thing, there's Black Lives Matter in the Bernie campaign, right? It keeps showing up, right? And this is a tension that I think we're in a moment where we could get this better than what we've ever gotten it before. We're in a moment where we have to have an economic populism to undermine Trump's junk populism. If we don't have an economic populism, if our narrative for the next 4 years is bonding with each other over how backward half the country is, we will lose. There's a real danger that Trump will consolidate a right-wing populism, that he'll consolidate a right-wing populism that becomes popular. That we see him messing up like crazy right now, and we think ha 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 ha. But he passes an infrastructure bill, he starts a war. Anything's possible right now, and if you don't think it's possible, ask yourself if you thought it was possible for him to get elected. So we need to take that mantle from him by actually having economic populist positions, naming Wall Street and the 1% and the billionaire class, the bankers, et cetera, as an enemy. However, we can't do that in 2017 by ignoring the grievances of particularly aggrieved communities. We have to have a progressive populism that centers race in the United States, right? And that also centers other grievances. And this isn't an easy thing to do, right? But we have to figure out how to do that. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were getting at, but I think that there's good examples of this. And what we've come to in our narrative is that we need Obama's we and Bernie's them. And what I mean by that is when you look at Obama's speeches in 2008, his campaign speeches, he tells a story of America that is actually beautiful and amazing. He tells a people's history of America from the perspective of all the groups that fought to be included in those aspirational 3 words, we the people. The suffragettes, the abolitionists, the civil rights movement, laborers, right? He's very good at it. Bernie isn't very good at the we. He just says a laundry list of people, like blacks and Jews, and but Obama wouldn't name the they, the threat, and that was shown in his governing too. Bernie was very good at that. So I think we need to figure this out. I think we have good examples. I think Heather McGhee is somebody in Demos whose speeches right now I look to. I think she threads this needle very well. And I think we have this opportunity in the Trump era where we both take that populism and recognize that his particular misogyny, racism, et cetera, there's a way for us to fuse these interests together, I think, right now.
Thank you.
So it seems to me that, okay, it seems to me that one of the things that we need to do somehow is to find leaders. And I'm not thinking only about people who are strategists or people who can, call a lot of people and get a meeting together. I'm thinking also about I guess I hate this term, thought leaders, people who can articulate this vision that we can get behind. And it has always struck me that it's very hard. I mean, leaders kind of emerge. You can't you can't make them. You can't create them. So how, they either are leaders or they're not. But how do you identify them, bring them forward? I mean, how does this movement now find the 2 or 3 or half a dozen people who can really articulate this overarching vision that we could get behind?
Yeah, so I don't think there are or there aren't leaders. I think that there's different kinds of leaders. One, like just to clarify the point I said earlier about there's a lot of invisible leadership, but there are leadership qualities that not everybody has and not everybody needs, right? Movements need some people who play leadership roles, I think, in the way you might be referring to, in a way that clarifies thinking, brings people together, aligns people in a common direction. And that is a unique quality. Not everybody has it, not everybody needs it, but we do need those people, right? But I think there are more people with those qualities that never get the support to develop them. And I think that there's a lot that we can do to develop those skills in people through training, through mentoring, through getting people involved in campaigns, a way to develop as leaders. And I think we need a lot in that regard right now. But one of the things I'm optimistic about, like I talk about this in my book, like I kind of came to the scene in the 90s and felt like a political orphan. Like I didn't have people who were involved in campaigns that were really dynamic and where they were, fighting and had a chance of winning, maybe winning some things. I didn't have that kind of mentorship. I looked around and didn't find it. I'm sure it existed on some level, but now we're in the wake of 6 years of dynamic movements like Black Lives Matter, like the Dreamers, like Occupy, like Fight for 15. And there's a lot of lessons being learned. There's a lot of kind of grassroots labs where people are learning these things. And I think we're in a much better place in terms of the potential for, I think there are a lot of promising leaders right now. I meet people who are like 22, 23, who I'm like really, really hopeful. They're so far ahead where I was at that age in terms of just like they're leaders now, right? They're leading people right now and they've got a really good, so. Yeah, it gives me hope.
Hi. So we've been talking politics and social change, and I'm all in favor of social change and hold progressive views and want to see more equality in this society. I'm also aware there are lots of folks who belong to different religious congregations who also have progressive beliefs and want to see inclusion and social change. But one of the things I'm aware of as a Quaker is that some of the language that you're using...
Use the other hand for just
some of the language that you're using would collide, for example, with traditional Quaker language in terms of naming who the enemy is and fighting and setting goals that you want to achieve as the most important thing to do, rather than paying attention to finding a unifying spirit. Mm-hmm. And I think if we conceive of, quote unquote, a group like the 1% as the quote unquote enemy, we lose an opportunity to change hearts and minds? I wonder if you could speak to that.
That's a really great question. I'm really glad you asked it here in this space, too. And I come from a Mennonite background, right, where we're even worse than the Quakers in terms of, like, we have a theology of non-resistance. It's called non-resistance, and it is what it sounds like. You meet the Mennonites who are more resistant, right, because you're Quakers and you're active, but, like, I meet all these people in the social change world, and they're like, oh, Mennonites, they do such good work. I was like, yeah, those are the ones you meet. It's not how I was raised. And I'm joking by saying worse than you, because I think there's something very good about this aspiration and this articulation of a we, to put it in the language that I use strategically, that is all God's children, or all people. And I want to answer this in a couple ways without being too long-winded. But the one is, I think that there's an important asymmetry between how reactionary movements and progressive movements name a threat or enemy. There's two things that are really important in this asymmetry. There's a moral level of this, and there's a strategic level. So reactionary movements tend to punch down. They tend to name an enemy that is vulnerable people, right? And they tend to name an enemy where the characteristics of the enemy are things that are intrinsic to their person, right? So the color of their skin, their religion, ethnicity, country of origin, sexuality, gender, right? And progressive movements, when they're naming enemies well, tend to name structural enemies, right? And so you could say naming the 1% or bankers or Wall Street is demonizing people. There is a danger that it can become that, I think. But it's qualitatively a very different kind of enemy, quote-unquote enemy, because it's a structurally held position. It's not something intrinsic to who people are. Does that mean that some people on Wall Street won't take it as a personal affront and kind of be a victim in that? I mean, of course they will. But I do think that there is a way to embrace the nonviolent spirit of social transformation and still name an enemy. I think the trick is to not personify that enemy. It's hard because personified enemies, like there's something about the 1% that just rang true, partly because there is a hint of personification there, right? And so I don't have the perfect answer to this, but I want to raise up some of that complexity around the question. I think that you can name enemies in that way, that your solution is not a guillotine, but the transformation of structures. And so I think that there's, it's interesting though, a lot of where we Beyond the Choir get our, so we do these narrative trainings with people where we help people think of protagonists, villains, etc. And our whole framework revolves around the we. And the research we've done shows that people are very attuned primally to the we, to the group, right? On a level that bypasses our language faculty. It's because we've evolved this way. We've evolved to be very attuned to belonging in the group, because if we're kicked out of the group, that's like that's game over, right? That's like the biggest threat to our survival. And so we're attuned to being part of the group and threats to the group, both external and internal. And so right-wing demagogues like Trump play with that by naming, immigrants as the enemy that are threatening the group from the outside and threatening it from the inside, the reciprocal generosity systems of the group by taking our jobs and collecting welfare, etc. Right? I'm using their words. I don't believe any of this, obviously. But what's interesting is that they are actually, they're not just playing to hate and fear straight up. They're actually playing to a deep faculty for solidarity, and they're manipulating it into an exclusionary solidarity where the enemy is a different kind of person. So our task is to name enemies that are structural, and to articulate a we that is inclusionary, that ultimately is everyone.
I'd like to add one little bit to that. I'm very much a Jesus person, and I noticed that Jesus said that we should love our enemies. And how can I love my enemies if I don't have any? So it's a real deficit situation. Quakers,
I love that.
Quakers should tell me I don't have any enemies. I mean, that's a whole slice of people I can't love. Jesus knew perfectly well he had enemies, and he was determined to love them. So I think that's one more consideration.
That's great. I'm totally stealing that, George. I will cite you. Right here. There's two folks. Yeah. Yep.
You talk very eloquently in your book about creating more on-ramps for people beyond the choir to be part of our school.
Oh, I can hear you because you're right here, I guess.
Our live streaming folks can't.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good. You talk very eloquently in your book about creating more on-ramps for people outside a choir to be part of these projected movements. I'm not sure if you talk about off-ramps, but I've been in enough organizations, we all have, where there are plenty of off-ramps for people to get out of that group. Dysfunctional people, self-righteous martyrs, no strategic thinking, no possibility of effectiveness. Could you talk a little bit about what your suggestions are for creating more on-ramps, and how do you prevent the off-ramps from multiplying in our groups?
Whew, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot in there. So on-ramps, there's a lot of technologies around it. There's a lot of tricks of the trade with on-ramps, right? There's like the classic organizers will refer to the ask or the one-on-one, right? It's like sitting down with somebody, asking them questions, finding out about them, what brought them there, what they like to do, what they're interested in doing, what they're good at doing, and then telling them about your organization and trying to find a match between what the person is called to do and feels good about doing and what the group needs, right? So that's an on-ramp, right? The one-on-one tool. And the ask is like making an ask. So that the temptation that we all have, we don't want to make an ask because we're afraid of rejection. So we say like, hey, there's going to be this rally on Saturday. It'd be great if you can come. If you can't, that's cool. But it'd be great if you could. Maybe I'll see you there. Cool. Great to see you. I never made an ask, right? Making an ask is me saying, it'll be great. I thought of you because of your interest in this. Can you come? And waiting for a response. Making the person make a decision. Because we know that when people give their word, there's a much, much greater chance that they will come, right? So that's part of on-ramping people. And then there's cultural things. There's making our spaces welcoming, right? There's generally asking people what brought them there. There's thinking about, not using a lot of acronyms and explaining our terms, right? Creating a welcoming culture for people. And I think the big meta one is this thing called activism that's emerged over the past 50 years. We didn't use this term more than 50 years ago, right? It's this self-selecting space, so we try to get people to come to it, right? We need to weave politics back into the fabric of everyday life. We need to think of asks not just as me asking somebody that I want to bring into a group, but what kind of ask can I give to this whole congregation or this whole union hall that fits what it sees itself doing in the world, right? But it's something that they can do all together, because that's how movements blow up. It isn't by recruiting people one at a time. It's by onboarding existing infrastructure and institutions so that all of the, not all, but like a lot of the capacity that those institutions that exists, that's where the capacity is in our society, right? It's in the institutions that we've built, right? So how do you get that those institutions to go to bat for movement ends? And there's a moment like there's never existed in my lifetime to do that right now. There are tech companies that would do something as a tech company, right? Because they're so appalled at what's happening. If we were giving them that right, those on-ramps to act as an institution. The off-ramps, in some ways, they're the opposite of the on-ramps, right? And so, people, one that I do mention in the book that I'll just say and then move to the next person is oftentimes the people who are most active will project the level that they're willing to give onto other people, and it's a repelling mechanism. And it's a repelling mechanism that sneaks up on us because, like, we're dealing with this right now with Lancaster Stands Up. We have an ad hoc committee of people who have been playing a leadership role in building this organization since the election. And the temptation is for really good leaders to be like, I'm just going to do this all the time. Some of them are starting to get pushback in their lives now, right, from people that matter to them, because they're operating at a level that they can't sustain. And so my role as a seasoned organizer who knows a little bit better is to have some conversations and make sure, because so I've said to people before, I'd like you to be doing this 2 years from now. So let's make sure that you're doing this at a level that you can keep doing, because your contributions are really valuable. You're a leader, right? But not everybody involved in movements does this full time, and we can't project that as the norm. Or we burn people out. Yep.
So I also grew up as a rural Mennonite boy, and so I want to challenge a little bit.
Where at?
Central Kansas.
Nice.
Different stock.
Yeah.
But I want to challenge that I don't think there's that clean break, that we always, when we transition communities, there's always frameworks or theologies or practices that we take with us. And so I think the question for both of you, stories or suggestions for when you're creating groups, encouraging people who are coming out of their old choir into your new choir to bring the best of that old that old system with them, and how they can identify what the best is, and then how do we make a space where the best of our old choirs can, I guess, create a new harmony if we're going to be very Mennonite about it.
Mennonites are really good at harmony. I don't know if anybody knows this. We'll do a demonstration afterward. I mean, I could name a number and we would both start singing it at the same time. It's true. Do you want to take it first? He asked both of us.
You might start singing.
Well, I have one that I think combines your question with a point you made earlier about on-ramps that have to do with existing institutions. In West Philly, at one point, there was a bunch of us who thought, wouldn't it be cool to be part of a national campaign that fights a bomber system that's going to be outrageously expensive and part of the arms race and so on. So we figured out how much West Philly would be contributing toward this bomber system. And we came up with $9 million would be our taxed contribution to that. So then we went around to PTAs, all the churches, just civic organizations of all kinds, who would never think of themselves as peace groups, and said, by the way, can you think of something that you'd rather have in our neighborhood for $9 million than our particular piece of this bomber system? Well, And we said we were thinking of setting up a festival in our neighborhood park, Clark Park, and we were thinking of calling it like the Fair Shake Festival, because our neighborhood deserves a fair shake. Do you agree? Yes, we deserve a fair shake. Well, you could come and you could recruit volunteers or run the pony rides or raise money for this or that or do a rummage sale, whatever, and be part of this if you'd like to. Oh, well, we wouldn't be counted out. And so we had the 45 organizations from our neighborhood, and it was a much more sort of, what can I say, this neighborhood. It was like before it got to be so much like it is now. I don't know how to characterize it. It's more just just folks kind of thing. And so people had a great time. The kids had a great time. Everybody had a great time. And we got a Congress member there, because we were a number of people, and he recognized so many of the people who were coming and said, oh, I have to be there. and get this message. And of course, we were laying this message, and he did indeed vote against the system. In fact, we defeated the bomber system because that was the approach we took nationally. So, and the way that I connect to your question with regard to that is that by doing that kind of organizing, you actually need multiple talents and multiple gifts, right? It's not only extroverts, it's people who have a craft or who do whatever, and they can all bring that to the table, and they can bring their own cultural background to the table as well. So some people will, do better with the Methodists than other people will, and so on, and you just sort things out that way. So it was very affirming both to our organizing group, because everybody's talents were used and their backgrounds and their cultural preferences and religious faiths, and also it was great for the neighborhood. It's a total win-win.
Yeah, I just adding to that, I think if we can start to, this varies for groups and campaigns, but if we can start to think of like our political groups not as the people who are doing the political thing, but as the core that is facilitating the broader involvement of various social forces to do the thing, right? And so part of that, when I said doing a one-on-one to find out what people bring, it's finding out those connections, finding out that background. Like, you're a Mennonite? Great. Are you still connected to a church? Great, right? What's that church interested in, right? So that we can think of not as our political groups as this enclave for us to like retreat to do our political thing apart from the rest of the pieces of our lives. I mean, that's the temptation, right? Because an enclave is a lot more comfortable, right, than like actually trying to get people in our lives involved in the political process, right? That can be very uncomfortable, and it can even be dangerous, right? So I don't want to glorify. Like, there's a lot of reasons why people don't engage certain places that they come from in political work, but that is the task of organizing, is to engage the everyday spaces, and so how do we set each other up for that? How do we find out what we're connected to and how we can engage that and support each other in that? I saw two hands over here.
It's important for activists to be informed on the issues and what's going on in Washington and elsewhere. And with modern day conveniences, it's just so easy to get that full coverage by the minute, by the second. But it can be a curse. And if you're a news junkie, you just kind of want that fix. And it gets to the point where it's not helpful anymore. So I was just wondering if you have any advice on striking that balance between reading and studying and doing and action.
Yeah, I would add one thing into that equation. I think I would challenge people to read. I don't know what the right percentage is in this, but to read, to stay informed about the news. It's important, right? You can't read everything, to be at peace with what you can't read. But don't just read the news. Be reading things about what you can do about it. Be reading things, I'll promote my own book, I'll promote George's book, I'll promote Dangler's book. Be reading things about how change happens, not just about the critique of the systems as they are, right? I think that there's some enlightenment thinking in society where, like, if you, and I talk about this in the first chapter of my book, where we think that we're going to get to the answers by having a clearer understanding of the problem. It's good to have a clear understanding of the problem, right? But that body of knowledge, I talk about that's knowledge of grievances in social change, right? The knowledge, but that's different than knowledge of the terrain of political power and knowledge of how to navigate that, right? So don't just read about the problems, read about understanding how social change happens, and then have your action be informed by both of those things. I don't know what the right percentage is. But I do think it's important. I think that it can be really depressing just to read the news. It can be debilitating, and it can be self-defeating. So it's a great question. And I think a lot of people right now are in that boat, partly because they don't have on-ramps right now. And so we've got to figure out how to build on-ramps for people to see themselves as part of social change. And did I talk about the civic face of resistance yet? Okay, let me just say that real quick. It kind of goes on here, but I think it's important. I think part of the reason we've been so successful in Lancaster over the past couple months since the election is we recognize that the resistance face, street protests, etc., that we need that. We also need an electoral face coming up of the opposition. But both of those things, a lot of Americans don't see themselves in. They see those as unfamiliar spaces that are other people's spaces. And so we decided that we need a civic face. And so we created these town hall meetings, emergency community meetings. That's a space, and we use Lancaster Stands Up. We're not trying to brand some pre-existing organization. Even though those organizations might be important, we gave it a name that just sounds like anyone in the town, right, who's concerned. And we use regular language in all our flyers and promotional materials, and we've created this space. And then in the meeting, we let people just process. We created spaces for small groups just to talk about how they're feeling about the moment before just jumping into the brass knuckles, the brass tactics, right? So brass knuckles, yeah. Yep. I don't have any brass knuckles, I promise. And that wasn't exactly your question, but it made me think of it, that I think we have to create some of those spaces for people, and we have to think about what those spaces are. And the last thing we say in our meetings with people is, and I'll say it to everybody here, I know that people here are, as probably a median or mean or whatever, very active in social change. But we say in those meetings with people who are not very active, in our first couple meetings, 3/4 of the people had never been involved in things, right? And we say, think about how you're going to be involved. And you're not going to know the answer to that right now, but think about a commitment that you will be involved. We got to this place because money has power in our political system, and we're not going to get out of this without people power. People power is people like you spending 2 hours a week, if that's what you have, to add to the capacity of a collective effort. That's the kind of capacity we need to turn this around. So think about what that looks like for you. Is it going to be 2 hours a week? Is it going to be 4 hours a week? What's sustainable? What capacity are you going to add? We encourage you to join one of the working groups that we're recommending. Chances are the first thing you try isn't going to work. Come back, join something else, join another group, learn, start your own group. Whatever it is, commit to keep coming back and to being involved. And so that's the kind of wrap that we give. And yeah, it seems to be working tentatively. Yeah.
You saw someone else.
Yes.
I believe.
Yep.
This is a big one, but it's more just like, what's your quick take on why hegemony? And it's in the title. And so, because I know what I think about is even among the balance of expressive or life of the group and affecting political outcomes, I find myself in debates about what those outcomes should be, and particularly about the balance of kind of outside the system demands versus making demands of the system, and this kind of inside-outside balance. And so curious about kind of curious to go there a little bit, and with a framing of like why hegemony and why you found it to be important in kind of your studies and for strategy moving forward.
There's fierce debate over whether this is an effective title for a book. Naming a book is very hard, too. In some ways, it's a provocation, because hegemony and, on some level, power is something that people on the left tend to think of as what our opponents have and what we do not have. And so I take what's that? And don't want, right? We stand comfortably outside of power, right? We are the sideshow on the margins, and the main stage is somebody else's. And this is a provocation to seize the main stage. And it's a provocation to say, so I use Gramsci's kind of definition of hegemony, which is like consent of the governed, right? And key in his idea of hegemony is that the hegemonic force is defining the common sense, right? And I provoke the left to want to have a hand in defining the common sense. We believe that do unto others as they would have them do unto you is a better common sense than greed is good. We want that to be the norm. We want that to be the common sense, the values of society. We want it to be deviant behavior to say greed is good and for there to be social sanctions for it. We want to be hegemonic in that regard. And then I say that if you think that defining the common sense is, so I actually wrestle with ideas of coercion in here. I can't give everything away, but these are complicated moral questions. Defining the common sense, I say there is a coercive element to it. I even say that direct action, a lot of times we in the left cling to direct action and we think that it's not coercive. Direct action is like doing a thing with a small group of people that you want to affect the rest of society. That's like there's actually a pretty big undemocratic component to it, right? That I think is necessary because of how screwed up everything is. But we need to take responsibility that we are trying to intervene to shape the direction of society. There's a heaviness that comes with that because most of the people who have tried to do that and have had no reservations about doing that have done horrific things, right? But yeah, there's a beautiful Martin Luther King quote in here that kicks off chapter 5 that is about this, about power and about the false dichotomy between love and power that we need to wrestle with, that we need to understand that those concepts can't be held as two different camps, two different kinds of people, right? Otherwise, those who want power get to have it. And those who want to love, they can love impotently, while reckless people, drive our civilization over a cliff. So that's why Hegemony How-To. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see if it ended. Well, I think first question was going to be around the experience you've had around trying to scale to a larger than a city or a community issue. And just building off of your last answer, I think the reframe is, are there adaptations that you would recommend to how to help the common sense be better governed? Because I find sometimes we can build grassroots power, and then when it gets into the electoral system, it loses its relevancy and its roots. And so I'm all for reframing, taking over the Democratic Party, whatever that looks like, and I wrestle with how that can happen when when there's so much beautiful grassroots struggle going on that gets corrupted or co-opted once it gets higher. So I'm curious about that lift to larger systems.
One of the really hard constraints we have, actually, this is the last question, and I think you might have a thought on this. Do you want to go before me, and then I'll end it?
Well, one reason why I wrote the book actually was because of this particular struggle of Viking economics, how the Scandinavians got it right and how we can too. Because what I was studying was for nation states. Now, those are not huge nation states like ours, but nevertheless, it's way more than the, say, the Swedish co-ops, that were beautiful, and they wanted to go national, and so on, with the other countries. And so so that's one reason why I wrote the book. And I think that they demonstrate that it's possible to scale up things that are beautiful on a grassroots level and on a national level. There are sacrifices that, there's going to be more control elements in order to articulate a coordination of the beautiful things that are happening at the grassroots. But it's notable to me that when the Norwegians struck oil, which wasn't until the late 70s, so they'd already gotten rid of poverty, they'd already gotten the free higher education and free health care for everybody and universal pensions, and they got their main goodies in their system really cracking by then. But then they came into this big pot of oil and gas, which is both a problem and an asset. And they decided, let's take some of that money and see what we can do on decentralizing our system. Now, there's only 4 million people, so you might say, what? You're already decentralized. But that question that you're raising was even on their minds as such a relatively small country. And then they were able to make some progress in terms of increasing diversity on a grassroots level by putting money, time, personnel into that effort. So I like the tension, actually. And I think we shouldn't give up on the tension and just be grassroots forever or national level forever, but look for the synergistic and delightful outcomes that you can get when you keep that tension going and stay creative.
And George there's a great part in the last chapter of your book that talks about scale, which is really interesting, comparing. I mean, it is one of the things in this country. We have a huge country, which presents its own problems related to the question that you have. And George has some very interesting things about that, about what's good for scaling and what's not good for scaling in a smaller country and a larger country. I think the last things I would add to this are, I totally agree with what George just said about it's a tension that we should live with. Like, I don't know what the right phrase is, whether we should take over the Democratic Party. I mean, somebody should. Heads should be rolling. Sorry, that's not nonviolent, but we'll remember that with sorry. But figuratively, usually when a party loses as epically as they did in 2016, heads figuratively roll and new leadership assumes that place. We're not, and that happens partly because there's a farm team, a bench that's ready to demand that, and we have a weak bench. I think the opportunity that we have right now is to blur the lines intentionally between outsider movement and electoral strategy. Not in a way that confuses ourselves, but in a way that we have an opposition that has these different faces. We have an opportunity for candidates to come up in relationship to social movements and therefore be accountable to social movements, right? We need to ride with that, right? And so whether we say we're taking over the Democratic Party or somebody's taking over the Democratic Party, we want movements to be changing the direction of the Democratic Party because we are in a two-party system. That's a whole other conversation. But I think we have to come to terms as outsider social movements, right? Both with this local national tension and this outsider insider tension. And so with the local national tension, it is really important to build local power, right? National power, the root of it is local and state power. However, we have to recognize that most people don't care about local races. It's symbolic races at a national level that can animate local races. And so we have to tap into that. We have to figure that out, not think of this dichotomy as like we should just focus locally. We should focus locally. We need to get people to run at all down ballot races. But we need to think about what are some flagship national fights that can animate those races. You know, like getting Bruce Springsteen to run for Senate in New Jersey, right? That would animate all the races. And I'm serious about that. We should start drafting that guy right now. But even having Trump be at the head of the state, that does animate the down ballot races. And so we're in a moment for that. And then with the outsider-insider, I think there's a tension where we think we just want to build outsider power, but we have to recognize things like the Bernie campaign onboarded more people than what most efforts could combine, right? So people get on board with these presidential campaigns, one, because they have mechanisms to do it. They have a scale. So we have to figure out how movements can harness some of that energy and not just think this kind of zero-sum game where we're like, oh, that's taking energy away from outsider movements. We were not activating that energy beforehand, right? It's not taking away, it's actually creating a huge on-ramp that we could provide other things for it to do. So these are hard questions, but I think we're in a moment where we could really get on the right edge of that curve, or whatever the expression is. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, George. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, friends. So glad you were here tonight. We're honored to have you here tonight. If you have lingering questions, you might want to step into the foyer, have a cup of coffee or some cookies. And, well, you know, you can always make more. That's where leadership steps right in. And buy books, and have them sold, and have them signed. So please go right ahead out and